Writing short stories connected with your book series can be an easy, great way to actually sell that series, get reader interest, and give them a tidbit to keep on enjoying your books. But how do you come up with those short story ideas? And how do you frame them out? And how does this whole thing work? Sure, I say it's easy, but is it really all that easy? Well, in this fantastic interview with H.L. Burke, she shares all of her secrets for writing short stories that help sell series. This is something that she has experience with. The woman has many, many book series out there. And of course, when you have those short stories out there, it can help sell your book on autopilot so that you can keep doing your author life well. So make sure that you stay tuned for this fantastic episode. And again, if you hear the word author elevate around there, that was when I was using that specific name. Of course, now I'm using author culture and just my name, Janeen Ippolito, but the content's fantastic and you definitely want to tune in. I am super excited to be here with the amazing H.L. Burke, also known as Heidi. But as we all know, H.L. Burke is her stealth author name, which kind of makes her a spy superhero.
Vigilante.
Vigilante. There we go. And we've had Heidi on Author Elevate several times already. And Heidi and I actually used to co-host the Indie Book Magic podcast back in, 2017 to 2019, I think.
Yeah, it was right before we moved. So around there, was it that? I guess, yeah, it was just before we moved. So that we moved in 2020 because that's when I wrote Reformed. So yeah. Okay.
And she is super experienced in the author industry. She writes many, many books, and she is also a fantastic friend. And so, yeah, Heidi, thank you for coming back with your missing invisible cat.
I know. I was so hoping he was sleeping in the basket, and I was like, he's going to stay in the basket. He'll be right there. I can reach over and grab him. He won't like it very much, but I'll at least get one free cat shot. But then he disappeared, as they tend to do. He's probably downstairs sleeping on the bed.
I mean, he has better things to do than be on a YouTube video, right?
He's very busy. He has an important cat business every morning. We don't know what he does, but he does many things. Yeah.
Many, many
Yes.
things.
Yes.
So, for anyone out there who is not familiar, here's Heidi's quick bio. H.L. Burke is the author of multiple fantasy novels, including the Supervillain Rehabilitation Project series, the Spellsmith and Carver steampunk series, and Ashen, which is a Cinderella retelling. She is an admirer of the whimsical, a follower of the light, and a believer in happily ever after.
That about covers
Now,
it.
So speaking of happily ever after and endings, what about this Kickstarter you've been doing?
Well, we reached our $600 goal, but we were pushing it to get stretch goals, including an audiobook. It's for a superhero anthology. There's 10 authors, counting myself, who all wrote stories within the supervillain rehabilitation project universe, which is my story world. They have a degree of connectedness to my stories. Like some of them are very involved, like deal with actual characters that I wrote and they borrowed them. Others are more just superhero stories that mention the superhero agency and stuff, but are just good old fashioned superhero stories. So it's very exciting. I have a good mix of humorous things and heartbreaking things and action things. So, and some very funny stories too.
And so heads up, if you're watching this before, when's the end date for this one?
The end date, it's got 8 days to go, so May 12th. That's coming up pretty quick. We only did a 2-week one, so.
So if you're watching this on or before May 12th, you can feel free to hop over and check out that Kickstarter while it's active. If you're watching this after May 12th, well, Heidi has other goodies for you that she'll talk about later in the description below the video, but the Kickstarter will be over and hopefully have an audiobook.
Yes, we need $95 more to get the audiobook. And I also said that we would definitely do a sequel if we get to another so far unstated amount. So we're kind of that. I'm hoping to do that too, so we can have even more stories. I like stories.
Yay. That is awesome. And that really ties into what we're going to be talking today about short stories and how they connect with each other. But again, real quick to back up, a couple of basic questions here. How long have you been writing and how many books have you written?
So writing professionally is very different from just writing for me because I was writing stories from before I could write. I would dictate things to my mom when I was like 6. Um, Writing professionally, I didn't really start till I was 27, and I think I just hit my 10-year publication, not necessarily writing because it even takes a while to get that first book out, but publication anniversary for my first book was published 10 years ago this last January. So basically a decade. And I don't know, 40 something. I counted a couple months ago, but I think there's been at least 2 books out since then. So I've forgotten. I just,
Yeah, you're very prolific. Like you just kind of can't help yourself. You're like, and I just kicked that little book out of the nest to fly away, and I'm working another one because that's what I do.
yeah, I get bored if I'm not writing. Pretty quickly. So I keep telling myself, oh, I can take a break now. Maybe I'll just spend a month or two marketing instead of writing, and that'll be a thing for a little bit, and then I'll get bored filling out forms on stupid websites and kind of like now I'm going to write a story instead because like it's all yeah, it's much more fun than doing the other things.
I mean, that definitely is relatable. Yeah. So, in your current massive verse, how many books are in the superhero project universe, SVR universe?
If you count the anthology and the one short story stand or that is kind of like my freebie, um, I think it's 21. The Game On, which is coming out in the end of May, is the 19th, I believe. And then I guess I would count the anthology as the 20th. And then I don't know if I really count the short story because it's kind of just its
Mhm.
own little thing. But full size books, it's going to be 20 then.
So, about almost like half of your overall writing portfolio is this universe.
Yeah, it did kind of take over at one point. Like I used to like hop genres like every couple of years from fairy tale to epic to steampunk to romantic fantasy to back to fairy tale. But then when I started writing superheroes, it just kind of took over. I think because it's a universe as opposed to a more contained. Like when I write like a book, um, I know if it's going to be a series or not right away. I'm like, this is a one-off. And that very rarely does not happen that I don't know if it's going to be a series or not. Sometimes I don't know exactly how many books are going to be in the series, but I'll know if this is a story that I want to keep contained or a story I want to expand and to have sequels. Um, this one, it's there is no containment. Like even my like my trilogies, I'm like, yeah, 3 and done. I'm not putting out more. The story's over. This one, I'm like, well, that story's done, but there's this other story over here that I could chase down if I wanted to, and it's pretty endless. I don't think I will ever chase down all the possible plot threads that are created in this universe. Yeah,
I mean, hey, that's exciting. It's always good to have lots of inspiration.
yeah, they're very loud characters.
Okay, now what's your most recent publication, and or you can also shout out your upcoming publication? I mean, of course you have the anthology, but other than that, do you have something recent, something that's coming out soon?
Oh gosh, when did Wishing on a Supervillain come out? Was that February? No, it was January. January. I had one in January that was Wishing on a Supervillain, which is my supervillain recruited to make a wish story, which was very cute, and I had a lot of fun doing that. It's one of my favorites in the universe. And then Game On. It's right here. I've got the proof. See, they're shiny.
Oh, it looks beautiful.
I think I said May 24th for this one is when it's coming out. It's on pre-order right now on Amazon. Um, so that one will be out, and that'll be the next one in this universe. And then I don't know, something new.
I mean, you always have like more books coming out. Like you'll say, "Yeah, I finished this one. Now should I do this one, or this one over here?"
Yeah, normally I just wait and see which one I get the most clear picture in my head for, and then I just jump on it because why wait?
Talking about short stories and how they work into larger universes, which is one of the main whole topics of this interview, let's lay the groundwork a bit by talking about what is a short story versus long form content. I mean, one of the obvious differences is that short stories are, in fact, short and long form content is long. And of course, because of things being shorter, there's going to be a compressed use of story structure. You're not going to have as many scenes in general. You may actually cut out little bits of a story structure that might be in place in a bigger story. But can you think of any other big differences in that area?
So with me, I always just look at short stories as kind of like telling a joke. You have a setup, you have a little bit of like build up, and then you have a punchline. So I'm not a very big of a story structure person. I feel like I kind of absorb it organically, but I don't think in terms of it. It's just what feels like it fits there. So for me, I think short stories do tend to need one single through line. Like you don't really want subplots in a short story. And usually a focus on one or a couple of characters, not like a whole group. I mean, there are exceptions to that work well, but mostly you just want one steady through line and just a very sharp focus. Whereas a novel can kind of split out, go that way, go all over the place, and it will still be
Yeah.
fine.
Mhm. Yeah, and I was thinking of because I beta read your Game On, which is your upcoming one, and you
Mm.
just there are so many POVs in that storyline, and everything. But in a book, you can do that. So you can just chase all those different POVs.
Yeah, and it's the tightness versus not is kind of the main difference. And you can have some really tightly written novels. I'm not saying because even I've done that. I've had single POV novels and stuff, but it's also I think a time frame issue. If a story takes place over a day, it makes it a short story. Usually, it's hard to do a novel that takes place over a day. Unless you're like doing a 24 scenario where you show every gosh darn minute. So yeah, um, to me, they are very similar in just like the way that they vibe. Because I think a lot of people with short stories will just submit a scene. When I've done anthologies for them, people have sent me and stuff. I'm like, well, this isn't actually a story; it's a scene. It doesn't, because they're used to writing that long form. They don't know how to tell a story in a shorter thing, so they'll just give a section of a larger story, and that's what they think it should be. And it's not. It needs to be a complete body. Otherwise, it's not a short story. It's just an excerpt. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I would say that's definitely something where when I've talked with you about short stories, I say, well, you need to, all those areas that you like to describe, you don't need as much description in this. All that complexity, that complex world building or that complex setting, that's not going to fit into a short story because you have to watch the word count with that.
I was gonna say, and you don't necessarily need to understand everything about the world of a short story because you're just getting a glimpse into it. I mean, if you have a character, this is something that I came up with a short story I was doing a bed of recently. Is like he was going in, and there's this whole like flashback where he deals with his grandfather and how that's his inspiration, but it in no way tied into the story. It was a great character building moment, but it didn't have anything to do with the story at hand. It was just his backstory. You don't necessarily need a character's backstory in a short story to understand how they're feeling in that moment. It might inform how you write them, but that doesn't mean the reader needs to know it to understand the story, if that makes sense.
And yeah, and that's why I love how you brought it back to, having a setup and then a punchline. That is a great way to think about a short story, especially if you even go shorter. Like that reminds me a lot of flash fiction or like 200 word fiction or even 300 word fiction where you need to really focus on even if it's intuitively, you need to focus on that plot a little bit more. You need to focus on intentionally what you're doing versus letting yourself kind of play and wander a bit more. If you want to play and wander, you might want to explore more long form fiction because it is about that tight setup and then that punchline, that problem and that solution. You need to still have that conclusion in there somehow. And if you get super complex about it, then you're just gonna go over your word count.
Yeah. Well, the thing about flash fiction, I kind of going to contradict what I said about short stories. I think some flash fiction works really well as just a scene. And especially if you're writing something tropey where a lot of things are implied, like you can drop people into a heist right at the moment where you're cracking the safe, and people will just assume everything beforehand because trope. And you just get that one scene of that happening. And sometimes that actually does work well for flash fiction. I've read a lot of flash fiction that basically just sets up a mood, gives you a feeling, and it's over. And I don't mind that for flash fiction.
Mhm. Yeah, that is true. That is a good point for that one. That is a little bit of a difference. But even then, it has to work in a certain way, which is why you see some people who just sort of, they intuitively just sort of churn out flash fiction pieces because they
Yeah.
kind of get what you're supposed to do in that situation. Now, talking about short stories, you've done, of course, a number of one-off short stories that just kind of exist by themselves. But you've also written a number of short stories connected with within your larger universes. So there's one, I think there's a short story for your Nissa Glass universe. There's one for Spellsmith and Carver, and
Too.
then you have Relapse two for Spellsmith and Carver. Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, I like those guys.
And
I
then
like
you
Jericho.
and then you have Relapse for this one. So is that all of the ones, all of the short stories that are attached to bigger universes? Am I missing one there?
Well, there's Rethink, which will be in the anthology that's coming out. So it's not out
Yeah.
yet, but the first story in the anthology is Rethink, which is my short story based on kind of it's a background story to the whole DOSA agency. So yeah, I think that's it. If there is another one, I forgot it. So
I mean, that happens. You've got a ton of books out there. So,
yeah, and sometimes I'll like, oh yeah, I did write that. Those
okay. So, what was the inspiration for writing these stories? Was it just for the fun of it? Or did you actually have a marketing purpose as well, especially with some of them being prequel kind of stories that you can, of course, offer for free in different places?
most of the time they're just because there's a story within the universe that I doesn't fit into the novels that I want to tell. I don't, generally speaking, force myself to write something. The exception would be Rethink, because when I decided I was going to do an anthology with a bunch of other authors, I was like, okay, well, I have to have a story in that. It wouldn't make sense for me not to. So I was like, well, okay, so I have to write a short story in the Espera universe. What is a story or character who has been under not necessarily underdeveloped, but underfeatured? Who and I was like, the father figure of Prism, the lead in Reformed, he has cast this huge shadow over the series, but he's been dead since book one because he died when she was, I think, 21. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and he was Fade's mentor, and he was Aiden's father too. And there was like everyone brings up Kevin Powell and what a difference he made on the universe and on the people he touched. I'm like, well, I'd like to see what that guy was like a little more, but he's dead. Whoops. And like, but he wasn't dead in 1991. So I'm like, I'm gonna do a story about Kevin and show how he came into his superhero powers, how he met his wife, and how he became the hero that made such a difference. And that was, once I had that settled, that I knew I was going to write about Kevin. It came together pretty well, just because even though he hadn't been on the page, I understood who he was, just how, from the influence he'd had on his children and the people he worked with, and just the story as a whole. So for me, that one was done a little bit for marketing, just because I knew I had to have something in this anthology, which is, I mean, it's a piece of art and something I just did for kind of fun because I want to work with writers, but it is still also a business decision. Putting out a book, kickstarting it so I have the money up front. That's all things that I know I'm going to have to make money on them. So, whereas opposed to Relapse is actually just because I was thinking, which is another story that actually features Kevin in it. um, I was going through my backstory for Fade, trying to figure him out, and I had all these conversations in my head that took place between him and Kevin that helped him decide he wanted to leave the villain path for the hero path. And so I just wanted to write something around one of those to get it out there. So that one was more of an emotional thing. You don't really need to read it to understand the series, but it does, I think, help just to get Fade's
Mm-hmm.
mindset. So for those, that
Mm-hmm.
was what I was doing. Very different reasons, but yeah.
Yeah, and I love how, there is that interplay of, hey, I just want to do this, and hey, I'm really interested in this, because that can be really helpful for fuel. I've heard online and seen online with authors going, man, I thought a short story was going to be really easy, but I don't know what I'm doing. Like, this is actually feels harder. And if you can't hear it, those are the baby birds
I like the baby
just
birds.
cheeping away. Yeah, they're robins, and they're just right outside the window there. But yeah, they can get really flummoxed, and sometimes that can be because you're sort of forcing it, and because you're making yourself do something, and you're assuming if you make yourself do it, oh, it's a short story. Even if I'm forcing it, it shouldn't be that hard. But you underestimate how difficult writing can be if you don't have that motivation or that inspiration to do it. So that's definitely a good thing to balance out with the marketing stuff.
Yeah.
Now, being that you said a lot of times, well, I wrote this out of creative inspiration first, how have you used these short stories for marketing? I know with this one in particular, anthologies can really be helpful for being jumping on points. So people read, get this, maybe read it for free or something and go, oh, I want to binge read all of Heidi's books or something like that, or I want to check out these other authors and their books. So that can be a way to do it. But how else have you used these short stories that are part of larger universes in your marketing, even if you didn't intentionally start out trying to like make them marketing material?
Basically, I just give them away for free wherever I can. It's like a little sample of things, and hopefully gets people hooked into the universe. And I'll get occasional reviews saying, "Oh, I read this, and now I'm really excited to read the next book." And it does help. It is a little bit of a fishing expedition because, especially when you're giving it away free, people will grab it who aren't that invested. They'll read it really quickly to do their Goodreads challenge, or because it fits some writer bingo card that they're doing, or reader bingo card. Those are things like if you have something that hits a
Oh, yeah.
reader bingo card, so people will do that, and then excuse me, the then you've met someone who you might not have got in front of their eyes if you hadn't. And I think that's a good thing. But like all fishing, if you're doing a free book, you're going to get some people who aren't your audience.
Yeah, and there has been some back and forth lately about, well, how effective are free things? Is the market oversaturated? I would say if you have a decent enough cover and the story itself is, has an interesting hook to it, I still think people will try it out, and maybe they'll be less intimidated because it's a sample. And I don't think that free samples are ever going out of style. Maybe there's a ton of them out there, so visibility might be harder, but I don't think anyone ever turns down a free sample of something in a genre they like. They're not going to suddenly say, oh, no, I don't want that sample piece of chocolate or those things. It just means you might have to work a bit harder to get seen with that sample.
Yeah, and there's so many options for free books nowadays, even if you don't just do the freebie for marketing, that if people are the type of people who are never going to buy a book, they just always want it for free. They've got so many options that they can read uh public domain stuff. They can read library books. They can, read fan fiction or on Wattpad. So it's not like they're gonna immediately buy your books because you have a free one, if or not buy your books because there's a free one. So I don't know. I don't see if any loss like courting readers who read free books, because some of them do buy books and some of them will review and talk about it, and that word of mouth is good. I think some of my best reviews for my short stories have come off people who found them when they were on a free day. If they have gotten some surprise reviews from people who I have no connection to, and I'm like, well, how did you find me? Because when you're an indie, there's that thought. It's like, oh, well, how did they find me? Because there's so many books out there. Did they just dive into Amazon and randomly stumble on mine? It almost feels impossible. It's like, oh, they picked up this one grain of sand on the beach, and it happened to be my grain of sand. Unless there is a connection or I've been advertising or
Mm-hmm.
something. And it's like, yeah, but I was like, how'd you find
Yeah,
me?
you kind of like, yeah, where'd you come from? Like you start getting detective like things out and go, well, where'd they happen? Or oh wait, maybe it was from this blog post, or oh, so and so featured me in this short video and I didn't know, or things like that, where suddenly you realize where the visibility came from.
If I see a specific spike on a book, I will Google that book to see if it popped up somewhere. Like one time, I sold like 5 copies of Blind Date with a supervillain in one day, which if I'm not doing a promo on a specific book, that's a pretty good spike. And like, where'd that come from? So I Googled it and somebody had recommended on Reddit.
Well, hey, that works then.
I thought that was pretty funny because like usually like it's so satisfying when you can find out the cause. It would be much more satisfying to just always sell the books like that and then not have to worry about where they're coming from. But it is what it is. You're like constantly trying to keep that balloon up in the air like you did when you were a kid. You ever played the balloon game? Don't let the balloon touch the
Oh
floor.
yeah.
That's
Oh
what
yeah.
Amazon rankings are. If you just ignore them, they just go down.
Yeah, and that's the story with rankings in general, and I think that's the undeniable retail side of things that authors sometimes don't really get, because books are inherently creative, and so you have to create them and you enjoy that part. But to a lot of people out there, it's just a product, and if you're not promoting the product, then no one knows and no one can look at it and think if they want to buy it or stuff on the other end. So it's an interesting push pull there.
Yeah, and whenever I don't market for a while, I always see that. It's inevitable. So, and then it takes a
Hmm.
lot more work to
Hmm.
get out of that. So it's constant.
Oh yeah, yeah. All right, so how do you come up with a concept that is connected with a story world but still stays short enough, rather than writing another book in that story world? So say you have these little shorts with Kevin Powell, well, what made you go, okay, I can do this as a short story. I don't really need to write another whole book on this? Because I could see some authors going, well, I love this idea, and I really tried to write a short story adjacent to this story verse, and then it turned into a novelette or a novel, or it got longer, it got bigger. So, how did you find a way to keep things short?
Well, with both the Kevin Powell stories, they were both kind of on a similar concept of the moment when somebody realizes something. And I think that's a very good turnaround for a short story because it allows you to have that character change without having like this very long arc. Because some character change, like growth, takes place over months and years, and the character has to get knocked down and climb back up 1,000 times before they learn their lesson. But sometimes you do just get that moment of epiphany, right? Where someone
Mm-hmm.
says something or something happens and it clicks. And with both these two stories, that was what it was. It's Kevin trying to figure out how he can use his powers for good because he's a telepath, and he's having a hard time controlling his power. So sometimes like other people's thoughts just make his way into his brain, which is really awkward with your coworkers, especially when they start to figure out you're doing it. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So there's one of his coworkers who really finds him creepy, and he's not trying to listen to her thoughts. It's just her thoughts are very loud. But the story is him having an interaction with a potential supervillain that he realizes that his powers are the answer for, as opposed to more brute force powers, and that realization is the kind of hero he wants to be. So just that one interaction setting him on that path, whereas the other one is Fade doubting that he can stick to the hero path, and Kevin talking him back onto it. Um, so they were both men around this like one interaction, and because of that, that keeps it very tight. You start with a character who has a question or a doubt. You put something in front of them that directly confronts that, and then they resolve it, and that's pretty easy. That's not the only way to write short stories. Some of them are more like, I think you can afford to have a little bit of a flat character in a short story. You don't need a huge arc. Like the problem that they solve doesn't have to be their self-worth or their emotional thing. It can be, oh crap, I my somebody's robbing this bank and I need to stop them. Just that sort of like uh, contained problem, but it does need to be a contained problem. It can't be, oh, I need to solve the whole mystery of who is robbing this series of bank robberies. I need to go from place to place to place and discover it and like find all the clues. Um, that just a singular bank. Just keep it tight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So some of my favorite short stories in the anthology are that they're a single heist or a single um, mission or a single. There's the one where the supervillain is going to rob a bank, but he ends up going there when a third grade class is having their school field trip, and he somehow ends up in with this third graders while they're going through their field trip, and he's trying to case the bank, and the third graders are like, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Like asking him kid questions, and it's pretty funny. So just that sometimes you can get a lot out of just a really good tight premise of what if for that kind of thing, which is something I like. Like for the Spellsmith and Carver, it's like the premise of one of the short stories is Jericho wants to make his wife a anniversary present and decides to use magic on it, and it goes wrong. That's just simple.
Yeah, I like that. And then I think for Nissa, you actually did a bit of an origin story about how she sort of ended up in her situation. It was kind of, although it was
It's a
like
little longer.
a
Yeah.
mini short. Yeah.
Well, the Nissa Glass series is a series of novellas, so they're all decently short. I think they're about 15 to 20K. So
Hmm.
that one I'd say is about 11K, which is a longer short story,
Hmm.
because it is a little bit of an origin story, and it's a little bit of a heist, um, with like a couple of things. But it's, I'd say, a 16 story instead of a more tight 3 scene, which is what I kind of prefer for a short story.
Hmm.
The one I'm writing right now is already
Good.
starting to be like, oh, this might actually not be a short story. This might be a novelette because I'm at
Oh.
6,000 words. I'm like, I may have underestimated how complicated this premise is to get across with the build up. So
Hmm. Hmm.
that happens too. But
Yeah.
then
And I
you get a longer
think,
book.
yep. I mean, hey, people usually don't complain. That's the thing. Like, I don't think you can go wrong with short stories attached to larger universes, especially if you have a fan base. They're not really going to complain, oh, I get another 5,000 to 10,000 words with these characters I love. Oh, what a shame.
Yeah.
Like, how dare you?
Well, the only thing it doesn't work is if you're trying to aim for an anthology that has a word count limit. And at that point, sometimes I think rather than try to hack it up, maybe put that premise aside and see if you have a different premise for that particular anthology. Unless I guess it's like you're running really low on time, I get. But sometimes you lose something condensing it that you if you it's not worth it to me.
But I think that that takeaway of really just focusing on a moment of change, or like a turning point moment or something like that, that is, I've actually haven't heard of that particular way of approaching a short story. I've seen some where it's like, try to take something about the story world and put it in miniature, or try to do like a mini version of something, or try to just go into one character's headspace. But like having it be like a shorter change moment at the beginning of something, or around what you have going on, that's pretty cool. And so, um, I think it's going to help listeners and viewers to like look at short stories a bit differently again, because they can be intimidating if you're used to approaching things from a longer form, and especially if you're used to writing this whole series in book form, and then to suddenly go, oh, short story, when I'm so used to thinking of each of these stories in much longer spaces.
Yeah.
So, with that, what are some tips you can give authors for creating short stories as part of larger story worlds? So, you've sort of talked about things in terms of what you've done with it, but if you're thinking about, authors out there, picture an author asking this question in a Facebook group, or they're asking, they're submitting something to an anthology or something, and they wanted to do a story, particularly that was attached to a larger world in some way for an anthology, as a prequel, as an extra newsletter freebie. What are some tips you would give them?
So a good place to start is things that you had to cut from the bigger book because a
So
lot of
true.
times, yeah, there's these sections of backstory or maybe this side idea, side adventure that didn't fit into the novel and it ends up not getting written or written and cut. Those are things to revisit and see if you can like flesh them out and package them up. Um, Another thing I like to do is look at what my readers are asking about. Like, what characters do they think are interesting that I didn't think were the focus? Like, eventually, I'm going to have to write a wildfire story because people keep asking for more wildfire, and to me, wildfire is like he wasn't supposed to be an important character, guys. He's support role. But yeah, or Marco. There's some characters who readers will want more of. And if you can look and see, well, what do they get up to on their day off or, when they're not with the other characters and it's just the focus on them. That's another thing I like to look at. Um, I like to look at like it's kind of become almost a joke about giving dumb things origin stories in prequels or like spin-offs and we don't need that, but sometimes it is kind of funny to like, well, where did he get the hat, where did he catch, when was the first time he used that catchphrase? Like, not everything needs an origin story, but if you're looking for a premise for a short story anyway, asking where two characters met, where something started is good. Or you could also see how things develop. Like, you may end a story when characters are just starting dating and you don't go all the way into the marriage and stuff, but you might want to look down the line and say, well, how do they interact now that they have a kid? Or if, you know, work is starting to get in the way of date night or something like that, and start looking at those moments that might happen later that aren't maybe worth a full story, but could be interesting to explore and tell you a little bit more about the character.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I love how you're giving these jumping off points based again on what's already inspiring them with the story. Because again, authors can get a little bit in their heads and go, okay, well, how do I plug things into a story structure here? And it's like, make sure that you find it enjoyable, and that there's a need for it, and there's kind of a spark there to play with. Don't necessarily just try to go right to the, filling in the blanks part of it. Now, if someone wants to do that, sure. If that's how they create, is by filling in blanks and kind of doing that, that's great. But you want that short story to have the same fun vibes as the rest of the, not fun, I guess, horrific vibes or whatever, depending on what you're writing it for. You want it to have the same tone.
Though it is kind of fun sometimes to play with other things off the side. Like the one I'm writing currently is kind of my take on Five Nights at Freddy's, which it's not really horror, but it's got like a ghost element and like a creepy. It's supposed to be this family friendly pizzeria that has like themes set up around fairy tales and like a guy walking around in a big bad wolf costume, but there's something inherently, a little bit off-putting about that. And so it's about this teenager who's working there, and her coworkers keep jump scaring her, and she's just at her end. And then she starts to think the place might really actually be haunted. And of course, there is a superhero or supervillain involvement, but that's a spoiler. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it does give you a chance to explore something in the world that you
Mm-hmm.
might not be able to do in a longer book, which can be fun.
All right. So, what is something that authors should avoid doing, or you don't really recommend, or can make it harder when they're trying to write short stories connected to some kind of larger story universe?
So I would say the main thing is break your own world building or break your characters for a story. Let's say you
Mm.
want to take a character and who has been established and they've had an arc and they've learned their lesson, and then you want to bring them back for a short story and then have them make the same mistakes again that they learned not to make in the other one. That just because it's easy for plot convenience, that's really annoying in a long book. But I think it can be tempting in a short story because you don't want to. You need something quick and easy, and you don't want to build up a whole new character. Um, or at that point, just put it in a different world or use a different character because you're gonna break things. Same with world building. It's like sometimes I've had ideas for stories and I'm like, yeah, but I kind of established that's not how this world works, so I can't do it in this one because I said that it didn't work that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that you said that because that can be, it can seem like an easy way out. And I'm gonna bring in someone we mutually know, Sarah Delina White, who just recent in the timeline of recording this video, decided that her trilogy was actually a duology
Hmm.
because she's like, I would basically have to, book three would have to be basically pretending like book two didn't exist. I'd have to have the main characters have the same issues that already resolved in book two. And I don't want to do that. They've healed from that. They're in a good place now. I'd have to re-break them again. And it can feel easy and familiar to do that. And we all know some authors of more or less fame who do this from time to time. But it does frustrate readers unless your readers are specifically there to see things break, and then you're in a very different genre space, usually romance of some kind, usually darker romance. But otherwise, it can be really frustrating because your readers are there to see a continuation of a story. It can get, it's sort of like pointless drama.
Yeah, and not that characters can't have long term, like, you don't want them doing the same mistakes over again, but they can always find new mistakes to do.
Oh
There's
yeah.
so people grow in weird ways, and sometimes we will grow out of one set of flaws or bad habits and just latch on to like replacement bad habits and flaws, which is interesting to see with characters who you deal with long term. Yeah, I've
Mm-hmm.
had some characters who I've now written across, oh, 20 in years, 20 years in story. Like I think Fade started in 2020 was the first story. Oh, if you count Relapse, that takes place in like 2015. So I've been writing that character from when he was in his early 20s to he's now like 50 something. And Jake, I started when he was 16, and
Wow.
so Jake started at 16, he's now 29. Um so and it's interesting to see the trouble Jake gets into is different now that he's not a kind of angry teenager. Now he's a little bit of a goofy dad, but he still has some of the same underlying character traits, but he reacts completely differently now, and he's gone from being a little bit of a cynical guy who being a real soft touch around kids. Just keeps.
I was gonna say he's mellowed. Like, I mean, I'm just finishing getting through his first book, which was, I think, was it Power Up or Power On?
Power On is the
Power
first
Up,
one,
and
and
then
then Power Up is the last one in the YA series.
yeah, so Power, yeah, that the Power one, the first one of his, and then comparing that to Game On, I'm like, wow, that is a very That's a very different character after everything he's gone through. He got beat up real good, and now he's all
He got
squishy and
yeah,
caring.
he got beat up and then he put himself back together and then he's been retired from DOSA for a while now, which I think is good for him.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sometimes you just gotta let things go.
Yeah.
And also, just so everyone know, I am also Team Wildfire getting more stories. And I know the character type. I have one of those too that they absolutely resist showing up in books. It's like they're terrified, and you know that you're going to do something bad to them. So I just like, no, I'm done. But I would like to see more of him as well. So there we go.
I worry the guy will get himself killed if I put him out there too much. He just does not have much sense of self-preservation.
Yeah, but he and Voidling are so much fun together. I don't even
Yeah,
want them to get together. I'm not sure, but they're just fun.
my idea for a Voidling spinoff would definitely have a lot of wildfires. I kind of see her as like you know those like 80s or 90s things where there was like a reporter or a ghost hunter or a psychic or a private detective who had an agency and they always had to work with the police and they always had that one police contact who was on their side but like also a little bit no you cannot do that. I think that
Yeah,
that
it's
would be
kind of
their guy.
like the
Yeah.
Watson to their Sherlock or something, the eye rolling person who's just like, what did you no, 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 that's not you didn't even ask, you just did it. And now you're telling me this after you did it. Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I kind of see that Wildfire would be her like she shows up at the Dosa HQ and he's like what now. Like constant. And she's like, oh, it's nothing. It just maybe a little bit of a accident. I accidentally robbed a bank today. I was wondering if you could help me. And then he'd be like, how do you accidentally rob a bank? And she's like, well, it's a long story. And then that would be the book.
See, again, it's the kind of thing where I would ship them as a couple, but that would be slightly dysfunctional or more than slightly dysfunctional. But I also ship them as just being in this weird not couple space.
Yeah.
It's really, yeah.
Well, she already made it weird when she flirted with Jake, though. So,
I mean, that's just her. Is it? Yeah, she's one of those fun characters who just kind of does things that make stories interesting and good and awkward and strange ways. And I mean,
yes.
those are valuable characters.
Yeah, she's fun.
All right, now it is time for the random question, which you did not get in advance. You have no idea what this is going to be. You get to assign each of your characters, and you can choose how many or how few characters because you have many.
Yeah,
You
that
can
would take
choose,
forever.
yeah, you get to assign each of your characters to do all of your daily chores and work for 24 hours. So anything that you usually do at all, you're going to assign a character to do that. Who do you assign to do what?
Let's see. Who has Kevin Powell's military background? He's probably very good at the janitorial arts. Prism is not, but she's a decent Italian cook. I do like cooking, but if I had to give it away to somebody else, I would probably give it away to either Prism or Tanvi or let them take turns and then I could have Indian food for lunch and Italian food for dinner. Um,
Mhm.
I would hate that. Corn, you're not in this interview. um, Wildfire has very little domestic upbringing because his family was super conservative and that was women's work. So he is
Mhm.
not allowed to touch anything. Uh, Jake can babysit Corinne so that she doesn't interrupt my interviews. And gosh, I don't think I have any other chores that I do. That's pretty much everything. Like, there's not a lot. There's not a lot of chores I do. Maybe Matt will tell me I'm wrong because he does most of the chores these days. So Fade can help Matt fix the truck because I feel like that is something that Fade would just be into learning
Yep.
how to do. He tends to learn random stuff and just be good at it.
Mhm.
That's kind of his thing.
I was wondering if that would actually be a little bit meta there to have you and Prism in one situation and then have Fade and Matt out there. I'm not, wow, that would be, considering that you kind of base them on certain characters and people,
Yeah,
like just picturing Matt next to Fade, I'm kind of like double blinking here going, wow, that would be interesting.
I think they get along. They probably wouldn't say
Hmm.
very much, but they get along.
That
So yeah, I guess that's my answer. Jake's
mhm,
babysitting. Wildfire is not allowed to touch anything. Tanya and Prism are
mhm.
cooking. Fate is fixing the truck. And who did I say was cleaning? Kevin? Kevin's dead.
Kevin?
That's not good. Yeah.
You're gonna have a ghost janitor.
Oh, I want a ghost janitor. That's a good book. Ghost janitor.
I mean, hey, there you go. This is time for your shameless plug, which you already had one at the beginning, but we're going to have one now too. So you can shout out more about the Kickstarter that's happening. You can shout out about anything else. Where do people find you? Where should they follow you? What's cool stuff they should enjoy or do with
So
you online, etc.?
kind of the nexus is my website. You'll find links to all my social media there at hlburkeauthor.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter and then follow me on social media from there. So I've got most of the social medias. I may not be as active on any of them. Like TikTok makes me mad. I pull up that app and it starts screaming at me.
Oh my goodness, it
I
is
don't know why
so
this.
true.
And everybody wants to be TikTok now. I've started pulling up YouTube and it starts screaming at me. Is it short?
Yeah,
I
YouTube
just
shorts and stuff.
I do not.
Although it's helping people find this channel, so I can't really complain. Like,
Yeah.
it's a thing.
Just why does everything have to be TikTok? It's like that all restaurants are now Taco Bell. All social media is now TikTok.
Oh my goodness, yep. That was that Demolition Man?
That's
That was
Demolition Man, yeah.
Demolition Man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so the Kickstarter is linked on my website and on my social medias, and it's if you look up Tells from the SVR universe, you will find it on there, and that's going until the 12th. And I really hope people back it so I can get my audiobook, please. Please, Ken has.
Yes.
I've got $95 to go to get my audiobook. So I keep refreshing my Kickstarter screen and seeing if anybody's donated this morning. Um,
hmm
so that's it. And I'm on Amazon. My superhero stuff is in Kindle Unlimited, but everything else I've been slowly moving wide because Amazon makes me mad
hmm
sometimes.
Yeah, I'm in that place now too. I'm starting to go wide again just because it just mm.
Yeah, they're
If you've watched any of my other videos, you know my feelings about the Zon. It
yeah.
is like this giant gorilla that sits on people and things, and you can't make it do anything. All right. Well, it was great. What is that?
It's a electric lighter for candles. This is
Nice. So, for those of you who are listening to this, because I do cross post interviews onto a podcast platform, Heidi's holding up a stick that looks vaguely like it could be a very long sonic screwdriver of some kind, but it is an electric lighter.
yes, and
Yep.
I wouldn't touch this part. I'm curious what that would do because it does look like a nice supervillain weapon. I'm thinking about how I can put this into things lately. Somebody who just has fingers made of this and it just goes.
It was great having you on and interviewing you again. You're doing awesome things. And yeah, so thank you so much for showing up.
All right, talk to you later.